In 1983, my boss asked me to go to a place in Italy. Udine is the name of it. It's in the foothills of the Alps in the northeastern corner of Italy, above the end of the Adriatic Sea. It's an out-of-the-way place. I got there by flying to Milan and then to Venice. I got off the plane right along the water, and I stayed overnight in Venice. I took a motorboat from the airport over to the island, the old original ancient city, and I stayed overnight in a hotel there. Accommodations were all right, but they weren't luxury. Everything on the islands is hundreds of years old and sinking into the Adriatic, and so it's you've got to like antiquity and old stuff to appreciate that. Nevertheless, I was picked up there by a representative from the company that I was going to, and the idea was that I was going to look it over and spend some time, 4 or 5 days there, and get a feel for the business of it and how it was doing, and with the prospect of possibly purchasing an injection molding business. So I went over there, and it was in January, and it was fairly cold. They didn't get much snow there, oddly enough, but the humidity was high, and every morning the trees and everything would be covered with frozen dew, which would melt off when the sun rose. But but the hotel, it was a nice hotel, and my room was marble lined, ceiling, walls, floor, everything was marble, and there was no heat. I come in after the day's activities, and I just couldn't get warm. I'd run the hot water in the shower, fill the whole room with steam, but it just it was really counterproductive because when that steam cooled off, it made it even more humid and more cold. So I had a really, as far as the facilities were concerned, it was really miserable. But it was an interesting place. I met the owner of the place, and I looked in every nook and cranny of it. It was not a large business. They had maybe 20 machines and some other smaller stuff that they did. And the offices weren't heated either. The people wore huge thick sweaters and jackets and so forth to work at their desks. Even wore gloves with a finger or two cut away so that they could handle the paper and whatever. But it was an uncomfortable climate. But the people were nice. It was an interesting time, and they took me one afternoon up into the Alps to a little village that makes traditional dolls and stuff, handmade things out of wood, and what they were trying to promote American markets, and they hoped that I would be able to establish a market for their stuff, but I wasn't interested in getting involved with that. But I went down to Trieste one afternoon, drove down there. It wasn't far, and a very steep slope down to the water, but it was an interesting afternoon. I didn't do anything there other than just drive around and look at the countryside and so forth. The owner of the place took me over to his parents' farm, a few miles from the plant out in the country, and as we approached, I noticed the trees along the highway or the roads leading to his farm were all just like huge stumps. The branches and limbs had all been pruned pretty short, and pretty grotesque looking lines of trees. And it wasn't just specifically right there, it was generally over the countryside too. So I asked him why they pruned the trees so severely, and he said, well, the branches that are taken off in the fall are used for fuel to cook during the winter. Fuel availability around this part of the world is pretty short. There's any coal, and oil has to come from a long way. So most farm people use the twigs that they harvest from the trees, And by the end of the summer, the trees are all bushed out again, and so they provide a meager fuel for the winter. He said that his mother lit a very small fire in the morning to make some coffee, or perhaps cook oatmeal or something, but very, very briefly. And then there wasn't any fire in the stove until the evening, and then she cooked a full meal, but very frugal with those branches that they had, because there was very limited supply, and it seemed like a pretty cold way to live, because that country wasn't really very warm, a subterranean country. It was too close to the Alps, and the elevation was rising pretty rapidly at that area and that locality. But his father had vineyards. Apparently he had quite a few, because he made about 6,000 bottles of wine a year. So he took me over to the winery, I guess you can call it that. It's a fairly large building, and it had a very deep basement in it. And we went down a long flight of concrete stairs into the basement. And along one wall were the largest wooden barrels I've ever seen. They must have been 6 feet in diameter. They weren't very long, maybe 4 feet long or 5 feet, something like that. But he had 6 of those barrels on a rack there along one wall, and he had bottles of wine everywhere. But he went in a back room there, and he brought out a bottle of wine that was obviously old. The bottle was dusty, and it had some cobwebs on it. So he decided to tap one of his prized pieces, because I was there. So he opened it up and poured each of us a glass, but I didn't care a lot for it, but they all oohed and awed. They liked it, but it had a flavor that, of course, I'm a big dummy, so what do I know about old wines? But the impact of the fumes in that basement just about got me. I was really feeling my oats by the time we got out of there, because the atmosphere down there just it was a free booze, free drunken brawling night on the house. If you stayed down there too long. But it was pretty basic living there, and it's not that they didn't have the money, but the availability or the lack of fuel was a serious issue. But the trip didn't pay out. My boss decided he didn't want to do that, didn't want to go overseas because of difficulty managing and so forth. So I certainly agree with that. That's a whole different culture there, and you'd need local people to run it for you, and be really remote control. I was scheduled to go to Finland after my stay there, but I got a wire from the president of our division, and he told me that they had changed their mind, that I didn't need to go there. I took a 4-day weekend while I was there. I took the train from Udine to Innsbruck over the mountains. It was a spectacular train ride. The train climbed up high, or crossing the top of the Alps, and from my train window I could see down, I don't know how many thousand feet down into the valley floor, and the small villages down there, and nestled in the little valleys and crooks and crannies between the mountains. And the train tracks were just cut right out of the side of it, very, very vertically inclined mountains. It was very spectacular, and an interesting ride. I got into Munich late in the evening, so I stayed there overnight, and of course Munich is where Hitler got his start, where he was born and raised, and where much evil has been concocted and implemented by those people. I wandered around a little while. I didn't find much there. I completely forgot about Auschwitz. Anyway, I took the train then over to Vienna, Austria. It was a fairly long ride, but it was interesting countryside there. It's on the north side of the Alps, although it's hilly and beautiful country. I stayed in Vienna overnight and a day. I spent some time eating at the restaurants along the sidewalk dining places. A number of people in the streets playing musical instruments. Vehicle traffic was really controlled, and the people walked in the streets and were not harassed by endless traffic down in this heart of the city, and it made a very, very attractive, very peaceful and interesting time. Some of those musicians were really good. And then I visited a museum there and the headquarters of Frederick the Great and all ancient people. It's a pretty interesting city. I was there again later on when I went to Kazakhstan and spent a day and a half there. This picture of Vienna along the river was a site of savage fighting among the Russians and the Germans when the Russians were advancing and capturing Austria and Germany. The Germans resisted, and of course the underground was also involved. It was a terrible slaughterhouse. And then I came back to Udine. Actually, Udine is the way they pronounce it. It was a very interesting 4 days. On another time when I was in Milan, I had a few days over the weekend, so I took the train up to Aosta, which is in the Alps, northwest of Milan. It was a site of a former post along the border between France and Italy, and it's a very rugged country there. Mountains are practically vertical, and Aosta is built on the side of a mountain. So I went up there, and I got off and wandered around and stayed a few hours, and I got the returning southbound train back to Milan, and spent an interesting day there doing that. When Shirley and I were over there, we drove up through Milan, and I drove across the Alps through Aosta too, so she could see that rugged country. Once when I was in Milan on a Saturday morning, I took the train to the Matterhorn in Zummerat, Switzerland, which is just a few hours on the train northwest from Milan. And I had to get off the train down in the valley and take a cogwheel train up the side of the mountain to Zummerat. They don't allow any gasoline-powered machinery at all on Zummerat. It's either electrical or horse-drawn, so it's very quiet. And I got a room in a hotel there on the side of the mountain, and when I looked out my window, I could see the Matterhorn in the distance. And it was a very impressive piece of real estate. So the next day, I went over to the ski lift, and they have a ski lift from Zimmerat up, not all the way to the top of the mountain, at least in 1983 when I was there, but a good way up there. And in fact, at that time, the longest ski run in the world was there. I think, if I remember right, it was 5 miles long once you get on if you started from the top where the ski lift ended. But anyway, I took the ski lift up to the top. And that was quite an experience, taking that carrier up there. They charged a fee for that, but boy, it was a spectacular sight from up there. I really enjoyed that. That was an experience. Tremendous snow and uh, the way people live in that part of the world. Of course, the people that go there are moneyed, and you don't see any poverty in that place. In 1980, I was in Italy, and I decided to go to Pisa and see the Leaning Tower. So I drove down there and I climbed up into the tower all the way to the top. In those days, the tower was open to visitors. The tower was built around 1400, and it was only partially completed when it started to sag, and its construction stopped for about 150 years. And apparently it's stabilized, so they decided to continue building it, and they straightened it up, straightened the construction up, so the tower actually goes up at an angle at its base, and then went straight up at the time of construction. But since then, the whole thing has continued to move. The additional weight apparently caused the sagging of the foundations, even over the centuries, continuously moving. The problem was that the Po empties out there into the ocean, and over the centuries that all filled in, and then construction followed the filling on a gradual basis until the current seashore is quite a distance from the church. When they evacuated in that area a few years ago, they found ancient ships buried underneath this dry ground, which proves the theory of the filling of the bay. But anyway, efforts have been made over the centuries to stabilize the tower without success. The tower is really a tube, and the walls are maybe 8 feet thick, and the center is hollow. And the walls are also hollow. They contain the stairs and the pillars that you see, but basically they're two walls like a tube, and the stairs are inside the walls of the tube. So when you walk up, you go in a spiral round and round up to the top of the tower. And over the centuries, countless thousands, millions of feet, shoes have worn the treads on those stairs into a really complicated pattern, and it's difficult to walk up that thing because the marble treads have been worn varying angles as the tower moved. It's an unusual flight of stairs. Actually, the nearest comparison I can make is the stairs in my hotel in Kazakhstan that were built by, I would assume, vodka-influenced Russians. But in any case, it was interesting to stand on top of it and look out over the village or the city surrounding it. And I calculated that if it toppled over while I was there, I'd land on the roof of a certain red tile building to the right of it. But in any case, it was an interesting experience. The church contains the lamp that hung from the ceiling in Galileo's time and still hangs there. And the tradition says that the swinging of that lamp triggered the thoughts of a pendulum and developed into the escape mechanism of clocks after that. But it does swing, and it swings in an arc. On the floor of that church is a marble circle, probably 15, 20 feet in diameter, whose periphery is aligned with the north and south poles, and the various degrees of the angularity are marked, different colored marble pieces. And as the day progresses, the arc changes, and you can follow the amount of change during a 24-hour period. It's really pretty incredible, and he was a very astute man to have recognized something beyond just a lamp hanging from the ceiling. And of course the ceiling is probably 100 feet high, so the pendulum is pretty long and it's slow moving, but its motions continue endlessly. On one of my trips to Italy, I decided to go down to Assisi and see where St. Francis did his thing back in the 1200s, and I stayed overnight there. And I went into the church where St. Francis saw the cross speaking to him, and heard the cross and saw it speaking to him about rebuilding his church. He eventually learned that he meant to rebuild the church spiritually, and of course it needs it now again. John Paul II had 2 meetings with worldwide leaders of all the religions in the world there, and John Paul kissed the Koran and joined in ceremonies of these atheistic pagan people. And shortly after Shirley and I were there, he had the second of these meetings, and not long after that meeting, the interior of the church collapsed. The ancient church that St. Francis had seen and worshipped in. The whole interior collapsed and did a tremendous amount of damage. But it was interesting to see St. Francis's old clothes still hanging there in pretty much ragged condition. We did go to Pompeii, and she saw the ruins and the evacuation of the mummified people that were trapped in the hot ashes that fell so rapidly and suffocated them and trapped them in place. Actually, their bodies were incinerated, but they left a space in the ash, and that space has been filled with plaster, so that it appears that there's a body there, but it's really not. It's just the filling of the gap where the tremendous heat of the volcanic ash destroyed the body initially. The voids lay underneath the topsoil for years before it was discovered. And of course they keep evacuating, but that whole city was completely buried and disappeared from all memory until about 1850, when a farmer was digging a well, and he found the bottom of the well ended in a old house there, and that triggered the evacuation of the place. But go online and read about it if you're interested. It's a fascinating place. I never encountered any hostility except from one place, and that was in the airport at Rome. I was going to go to Barcelona, Spain, and I wanted to exchange the lira for the francs, I guess it was, at the Bank of the Holy Spirit there in the airport, at Banco de Spirito Sanctus, as a sign there. So I walked over, went up to the window, and I laid my lira on the counter, and I told him I just wanted to exchange it. And he snapped me off. He told me, "You could do that in Spain. You don't have to bother me with that kind of crap." I couldn't believe it. I don't think the Holy Spirit was really too prominent in that bank that day. But anyway, I waited till I got to Barcelona and changed it. In any case, people everywhere are welcoming. If you have an attitude of respect, there's no problem in traveling. I never was afraid either. I walked through cities by myself, and I never was afraid. I know one time I was in Rome, and I decided to go down to Vesuvius and Pompeii. which is down a little below Naples. I decided to stay down there overnight, at least one night. And so I went over the train station there in Rome. I got on and went down to Naples. You know, it was just a regular train, a lot of people on it. I got off the train and I had to take a narrow gauge train to Vesuvius or Pompeii, and I had to go to a different dock. So I went over and the train wasn't there when I got there, so I set my suitcase down next to me and I'm standing there on the dock along the track there. And some kind of guy came up and he touched me on the shoulder and he pointed to my suitcase and he said, no, you hold. Apparently there were a lot of thieves there, and of course this was Naples, so it had a reputation like Chicago of being full of criminals and mafia. But anyway, he warned me about just setting my suitcase down next to me there. So I picked it up and held it. And the train came and I got on. The car door opened and all these people, there was kind of benches around the car, and they were all sitting looking toward the center of the car. And it was quite a few people on it. It was pretty full. And I stepped in there and all these dark, short little people, older ones mostly as I recall, but ominous looking people. I mean, they had the the thing around. The women had their kerchief around their heads, and the men were skinny looking, bad looking people. And I thought, boy, what have I stepped into here? So the train started to move, and there were about 4 cars connected together. And I looked down through the car. I remember the track curved, and the cars went like this. I could see the sides of the cars as they curved ahead of me there. And I saw 3 or 4 guys standing, young guys with knapsacks, standing in the car, 2 or 3 cars out in front of me there. So I knew they were Americans. You could spot them a mile away. So I just worked my way up through, and I let them know that I was there. And I didn't say anything, but I just asked them where they were from and stuff to make sure they. And so I didn't have any trouble, but I didn't take any chances either. I think in retrospect, I think the scary, maybe the most dangerous place I ever was at was in Kazakhstan. Well, I think it's time to end this one, and we'll go on to the next one for more Italy adventures.